Hi everyone, Stepan here. In this middle game video I'm going to talk about pawn structure, and I'm going to talk about the most common pawn structures in chess. Now obviously there's an infinite number of pawn structures you could get during a game, but there are still some that occur most often and which you can expect out of certain openings. So we are going to talk about the most common pawn structures that come out of openings. We are also going to talk about open and closed positions and pawn structures and what that means for your pieces. Now the main reason I'm recording this video is to encourage you to look at the pawn structures which occur out of the openings you play, because it's crucial to understand the pawn structure you are playing with. Now, regardless of what your pieces do during a game, which is strategy and tactics and whatever, whether you win or not, one thing is always going to be the same if you play the same opening, and that's the pawn structure. So it will give you a crucial advantage over your opponent who might not know that, if you understand what to do with the pawn structure in the openings you play. Now, to start off with, I'm going to use all the positions I've set up on the board. They aren't from real games. Obviously, these are just the pawn structures without the pieces to help you understand them better. And I'm going to start off with the open center. Now, the definition of the open position is when there are no pawns on the central two files, on the D file and on the E file. This can occur out of numerous openings, mainly D4 openings, but several others as well. And the main feature of this position is that it's equal. The main thing to understand about symmetrical pawn structures, first of all, is that if there is an equal number of pawns on each side of the board for both sides, then the position tends to be equal and drawing, because it's very hard to create a passed pawn. Obviously, both sides can lock down pawn structures on both sides of the board, and then neither side could create a passed pawn. So this is one thing you need to remember. The second thing with these open positions, when the D file and the E file are open, is that most pieces are going to get traded off. First of all, it's very easy for both sides to develop their pieces, because there's nothing restraining the central squares and there are no pawns controlling the central squares on the board. So obviously, if the center was closed or semi-closed, then some of these squares would be controlled and it would be much harder to develop your pieces. Now that the position is cleared, you can get your knight to f3, your other knight to c3, your bishop to d3, your bishop to d3, your other bishop to e3, and you can develop sort of like from a textbook. So it's very easy to develop, therefore it's very easy to trade off the pieces. And most often, the key thing that you are going to want to do in positions such as this one, where the center is open, you're going to want to control the open files. You do that with your rooks and with your queen. So ideally, you're going to place your rook on e2, your other rook on e1, and control the e file, for example. The first side to control the open files is going to be better, of course. Now, the thing to remember, develop your pieces quickly, take up the open file, and prepare to get an equal position, because it's going to be really hard to make any progress here. The second example I wanted to use, as opposed to these positions, is a closed center. Now, I've taken a position from the advanced Caro-Kann right out of the opening, after white plays e5 and black plays bishop f5, e6. Now, the only difference is that you should imagine the black bishop on f5 and the white knight on f3, for example, in the short variation. Now, you can obviously see that this position is much different than this position, and the fact that the players have chosen to play the opening where the center is closed changes the position significantly and changes the style of play. Now, obviously, as your first plan in this position would be to place your rooks on the open file, which is the most sensible thing to do. Doing the same thing here wouldn't make too much sense. If you put your rook on d1 here, then the rook isn't doing anything behind the two pawns. So your style of play is going to be different. The key thing with closed center positions is that you have to find your pawn break. The only way to activate your position, the only way to activate your pieces, is to break open the position, and those are called pawn breaks. One thing you have to remember is that the side at which your opponent's pawns are facing, so in black's case the pawns are facing here, is going to be the side where your opponent's pawn break is going to be. This is just a general rule. So for example, the white pawn structure is going this way, so white is going to look for the pawn break with f4 and then f5. This is the general rule. Of course, white can also try to find the pawn break somewhere else, but in general, wherever your pawn chain is facing, this is where your pawn break is going to be. So if you have a position with a closed center, As black, if you play the Caro-Kann, you already know that the move here is c5, and as white, you know that the moves are f4, f5, and generally, if you don't know the exact position, which is going to be most of the time because you won't always be in the opening, look for a pawn break on the side where your pawn chain is facing. So this is the only way to activate your pieces. With the closed center, look for a pawn break. The third thing I wanted to mention is the semi-open center. This could occur either with the open E file or with the open D file. Most often it occurs with the open E file, and this is a position out of the Petrov defense, and very often you are going to see this out of the Petrov where the E pawns have been exchanged. And the main thing in this position is that whichever side is faster to take up the file is going to be better in the attack. And of course I have highlighted the critical weaknesses for both sides, h7 and h2. You definitely, as white, don't want to trade off your light squared bishop. This is going to be your main attacking piece. And as black, you definitely don't want to trade off your dark squared bishop, because that is going to be your most valuable attacking piece. So treat positions like these similarly to the open center positions. Whichever side is faster to double up on the open file and take up the only open file is going to have much more activity. Obviously, if white has his rooks on e1 and d2 and his queen, let's say, on c2, his bishop on d3, then white's position is perfect. If at the same time black leaves his rook on f8, the other one on a8, his queen on c7 and his bishop here, then obviously white has much more activity. White can think of infiltrating the 7th rank, etc. So in semi-open positions, take up the open file. Obviously, this position is also similar. It could be different. It could be dissimilar, and in that case, it's going to be much more likely that you can create a passed pawn. In these thematic positions, once again, if the pawn structure is symmetrical, it's going to be very hard to break open the position and to create a passed pawn because both sides can block. Okay, to continue, I'm going to show you some standard pawn structures which come out of openings, and these are basically all the major pawn structures you need to know, and those are the pawn structures which occur out of 90% of the openings, and those are the pawn structures you just have to know, especially if you play the openings. Obviously, this is the Sicilian defense pawn structure. I have already played one pawn break for black, the move c5, and the white pawn was on c3, so this exchange happened on d4. And once again, semi-open position, play along the c file and look for your pawn breaks. As black, you only have one pawn break left, and you are going to want to use that. That will be the pawn break on f6. And as white, you might consider a pawn break with f4, f5, and trying to open up the king side that way. In the French defense, the play will usually revolve around the queen side, and you are often going to see knights maneuvering into the c4 square, knights maneuvering into the c5 square, rooks being doubled along the c file, a3, b4 being played, a6, b5 conversely, and players are going to be playing along this file because it's the only logical place to play at. Secondly, pawn breaks f6 for black, f4, f5 for white, and for white trying to attack, for black trying to activate his f8 rook and trying to have some play on the king side as well. And obviously, there is one key piece in the French defense because of which you need to play these pawn breaks, and that is the poor c8 bishop, which is often still stuck on c8 by this point, and this is why you need to play f6. You need to play energetically and try to develop your bishop. The second pawn structure I wanted to look at is the Roy-Lopes pawn structure, which this has occurred in probably 50,000 games. This is the closed Roy-Lopes without the pieces, and this is the pawn structure. You're going to have 8 out of 10 games if you play the Roy-Lopes. And obviously, black wants to play c5 to stop d4, or if d4 has already been played, black wants to take up the center himself, and white wants to play d4. And this position is quite thematic because of one knight maneuver which both sides tend to play. For white, it is this maneuver: knight from b1 to d2, from d2 to f1, from f1 to g3, and from g3 to f5. For black, conversely, the knight is going to come from e7 into g6 and then into f4 if possible. So both sides want to control these two squares. In the Roy-Lopes, The main break for white in the center is the move d4. For black, it's the move c5, and both sides are going to want to attack using the f5 square. Now, in some positions in the Royal Lopes, you're going to see black playing g6 and fianchettoing his bishop. You're also going to, in order to defend the f5 square as well, of course, sometimes you are going to see the moves f4 or f5 as pawn breaks, but rarely. The main thing to remember in the Royal Lopes structures is c5 for black and d4 for white, and using the f5 square. The next position I wanted to look at is the Sicilian defense position, which is most commonly known as the Najdorf position because it most often occurs out of the Najdorf, but it could also happen out of the Kalashnikov and several others variations of the Sicilian. The main theme of this pawn structure is that black has played the move e5, which left a gaping hole on the d5 square and the backward pawn on d6. This is the most famous position with the backward pawn. Now, if you haven't seen my video on the backward pawn, please do. I went in depth on how to play against it, how to play with it, etc. So do check it out. But as for this pawn structure, obviously black is going to try to use his semi-open c-file. Sometimes white is even going to castle queenside. So there are often rook sacrifices where the knight is usually on c3 and then the rook can sacrifice itself on c3. For white, the main plan is going to be to occupy the d5 square and to eventually win the d6 pawn. And the fact that black has conceded to such a positional disadvantage comes with a very good reason. And the reason is that black gets piece activity in compensation for this. So obviously, if black doesn't manage to get enough play with his pieces, this pawn structure is going to tell, and white is going to be simply better. And if he does, then the pawn structure won't matter. So obviously, in the Najdorf Sicilian, black is aiming for attacking as soon as possible and playing an active game without being worried about static positional weaknesses such as a backward pawn. But obviously, as white, you want to remember that you want to get your knight into d5. And as black, you don't want to allow a position in which white is going to be left with the knight on d5 and you are going to be stuck with the bishop on e7. This is a very famous position known as the good knight versus bad bishop, which often comes out of the Najdorf. And obviously as black, you don't want to trade off the defenders of the d5 square, namely your light squared bishop and your knights. So obviously you will want to control this square as much as possible. And as white, you never want to allow black to capture on d5 if you put a piece on d5, if you have to recapture with the pawn. As soon as you have to make this capture with the pawn, then obviously the d6 pawn is defended and the d5 square cannot be used anymore. So you don't want to place your piece on d5 unless it's defended by another piece and a piece which could recapture it afterwards. Okay, moving on. This position also comes most commonly out of the Sicilian defense. It could be played against the dragons. It could also be played against the Najdorf. It could be played against several variations of the Sicilian, and black will most often go for this pawn structure known as the Hedgehog. Okay, this is the Hedgehog pawn structure. Sometimes the pawn is going to be on e6. So black will play the Hedgehog, white is going to play the Morozzi bind. The most common way to fight the Morozzi bind is the Hedgehog. The Morozzi bind position is probably the most solid pawn structure for white. It comes out of e4 openings, obviously, and the Morozzi bind is when you have pawns on c4 and on e4. Now, these pawns are great because they are controlling the center and they are stopping black's main break, which is the move d5. In any Sicilian, black is going to want to play the move d5. Same as in this position. If black can at any point push through with d5 where the pawn is defended sufficiently, then he is getting rid of both of his weaknesses, and of course this is good for him. Now the Morozzi bind aims to stop the break d5, and basically having two central pawns like this is defending the d5 square a lot. Most common plans for white are going to be to control the d5 square even more with his knights. Ideally, it's very hard to do that often, but if you can get your other knight into e3, then your position is going to be great. But basically, you want to control the d5 square with the piece and never allow a capture after which you need to capture with either of the pawns, because then, once again, you get rid of the useful square on d5. Black will usually, as I said, play the hedgehog with pawn to e6 to control the square, to make sure your pieces can't enter. And this position is considered to be extremely solid. Very little chances for both sides, because it's really hard to break open the position, and white is never going to want to concede to giving away his Maroczy bind. So often these positions involve tons of maneuvering and patient play. I play the Maroczy bind myself against the Sicilian. You can see several of my games in the Road to GM series. The main problem in the Maroczy bind for white is that you are going to have a bishop on e2. That's the downside. You have a dead bishop on e2, and in order to activate it, you are either going to have to play f4 or c5, and then your position crumbles a bit. But this is a downside one can live with, because you are controlling the whole center. The next structure is also one of my favorites. Obviously, this is the Caro-Kann, and this is the structure which you are going to get out of most variations of the Caro-Kann, namely from the classical with knight to c3. And the thematic thing for the Caro-Kann are pawns on e6 and on c6. If you play the Caro-Kann, then I would recommend an opening with black, the Semislav, because very often you are going to have a similar pawn structure, and you are going to aim for the same breaks. And very often you are going to have the same dead piece. Often in the Caro-Kann your bishop is stuck on c8, so you either have to play b6, c5, or c5, or e5. And your main breaks in this structure are going to be to challenge white center, because obviously you are playing on the first three ranks. You haven't advanced any of your pawns further than the third rank. Your breaks are going to be e5 or c5. You want to challenge the d4 pawn, open up the position for your pieces, and activate your pieces. So if you play the Caro-Kann, this pawn structure with pawns on e6 and c6 will come in almost every game. And you will want to play the move c5 or the move e5. Most commonly it will be the move c5, and very often you can play it early on. I've seen many games in which players wait for no reason. You have to play c5 as soon as possible. Just get it over with. Obviously, if white fianchettos, which is very, very rare, then c5 is going to be a bad move, but most often c5 has to be played as soon as possible. The next pawn structure is the King's Indian defense. This pawn structure is very thematic. Now, it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but this is one of the main lines. And once again, look for your pawn breaks. This is an example of a closed center, obviously. Look for your pawn breaks in the direction where your pawn chain is facing. So obviously, white is going to want to look for pawn breaks on the queen side, and black is going to want to look for pawn breaks on the king side. And very often in the King's Indian, it comes down to whether black is fast enough in the attack on the king side, or whether white can create enough counter chances on the queen side. So white is often going to play the move c5, opening up this position, often creating a weakness on d6, and black is in every single King's Indian game going to aim for the move f5. And once black gets f5 in, usually the rule is when your opponent plays f5 or conversely f4, you have to take it with your e-pawn, because advancing could cramp your position and taking could create a weakness. So most often after f5, e takes f5, black is going to be recapturing with the g-pawn, trying to get his second pawn here closer to the center and opening up to the g-file to white's king. So the King's Indian pawn structure is very aggressive, and black is basically saying, I'm going all in. He wants to break open the king side and attack, even though his king is also castled king side. Now, in the King's Indian, the fact that the black king is here is much better than had it been castle queen side, because white is very fast on the queen side. And after c5, before c5, white is very fast to open up this structure, and very often black is going to be left with positional weaknesses on the queen side. So if the attack doesn't work, white's pawn structure is going to be better, and white's king is going to be much safer. Obviously, after the g-pawn is gone, the d6 weakness is created and the c-file is open, white will have much more play, but if white doesn't survive, none of that is relevant. The next one is the Benoni, also a very thematic, sometimes considered unsound opening and a very thematic pawn structure, and probably the only pawn structure which comes with an insurmountable weakness, and That's the d6 pawn, obviously. I would compare that to the Najdorf pawn structure because the weakness is very serious, and the whole play of the opposing side is going to revolve around that weakness. Obviously, in the Benoni, black is accepting the backward weak d6 pawn, and white is going to base his whole strategy around attacking that pawn. Now, the most common maneuvers will involve white's knights, the knight from c3 coming into b5, putting pressure on the d6 pawn, and the other knight from f3 going to d2 and then to c4 and then putting pressure on the pawn. So white can be very fast to attack the pawn, and black has to be extremely careful. Now, on the other hand, this structure is very good for black if the pieces get traded off. If the situation was like this, if there were no pieces to attack the d6 pawn, then black would be winning, and let me explain why. This is the main reason why players play the Benoni. If you exchange the pieces, you have a very, very dangerous pawn majority on the queen side, and you are going to be able to create a passed pawn. It's as simple as that. Advance your pawns, create a passed pawn, and win the game. White, on the other hand, cannot do anything. You can play the move f6, you can play king f7, king e7 or whatever. White can't do anything. The white king is going to be stuck defending the queen side. Your king can march up the board and just collect everything. So the Benoni is a very double-edged pawn structure in which if there are white pieces on the board, d6 is a very huge weakness, which is often fatal. And if the pieces get traded off, then black is fine, black is great, black has a pawn majority, and black is creating a passed pawn. So the Benoni is a very interesting opening. If you have nerves of steel, I would recommend you play it, because you're going to win psychologically. The last structure I want to talk about is the most thematic structure which comes out of the queen's pawn openings. This is the Carlsbad pawn structure, and named after a tournament played in Carlsbad a long time ago. This comes from the Queen's Gambit Declined, and from other openings as well, but namely from the Queen's Gambit Declined. And the main theme of this structure is the minority attack. Once again, if you haven't seen the video on the minority attack, please do. I have explained it in depth. But basically what white wants to do, white wants to play the move a3, to play b4 and to play b5, and then to weaken the structure here. So black is normally going to continue with a5 here, 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 and of course white will have played rook to b1 before, and after, let's say, something this move happens, black's best tries to ignore that, and then after this happens, white has created a weakness on c6, a backwards pawn. So the main idea in the Carlsbad pawn structure for white is to create the c6 weakness using the minority attack. On the other hand, if white is inactive, then black clearly has a pawn majority and black can start playing. But as soon as the minority attack was discovered as a positional idea, then the Carlsbad pawn structure started to get good for white. Obviously, black has piece play in this position, and black is going to have to attack. There are no obvious pawn breaks, there are no easy positional weaknesses he could create. The Carlsbad pawn structure is a very clear plan for white using the minority attack to create a weakness which he could pressure afterwards. In this position, white's main plan is to firstly block out the pawn. For example, a knight from c3 to a4 and then to c5. Once you manage to get a piece in front of the pawn, which is the main idea, once you are playing against the backwards pawn, blockade it first, win it afterwards, then white is going to be simply better strategically and positionally. I hope this wasn't too much. I wanted to briefly go over the main pawn structures in chess. I hope it was understandable. Once again, I would ask you to look at the pawn structures you get out of your opening. Just take 100 of your blitz games and create a statistical analysis. Remove the pieces from the board, take the pawns, and just remember on all the pawn structures, and take the 10 pawn structures which you most commonly get on move 10 or 15 and study them. It will often be one of these, but sometimes it's not going to be one of these. If you play the Nimzovich or something weird, then it's not. But it's crucial to understand the pawn structures, and it's crucial to see the pawn structures even when you are playing the game. If you have this position on the board, of course there are going to be 9 pieces on the board or 12 pieces on the board in the Najdorf, but if you can visualize it without the pieces, then we are going to be much more aware of the weaknesses which can occur and the weaknesses which are already there. I've seen many people play against the Najdorf without realizing this is a weakness and this is a weakness, so understanding the pawn structure is going to help you play better. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for watching. Hope you liked the video, and stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.